Hello everyone, welcome to week 2 in the Transportation Matters for Main Street's webinar series. We're going to just hold briefly for about 15-20 seconds to let some folks join before we get into the content. So just hang on for 1 sec to let a few more people join. All right, we'll get it going. Hi everybody, I'm Lindsay Wallace. I'm the Director of Strategic Projects and Design Services here at Main Street America. Probably recognize my voice from the intro last time. Thank you all for being here. We want to thank each of you for your interest that you've already expressed in this toolkit, and of course for your eagerness to participate in this 4-part webinar series, which was created in partnership between Main Street America and Project for Public Spaces. We'd also like to offer our deepest appreciation to Auntie and the Robert M. Bass Foundation, whose generous support has made today and this toolkit possible. We're so appreciative of their support. Just some quick housekeeping. As I said, this is a 4-part webinar series, so the first part aired on October 29th. The next 2 will air Tuesdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Central on November 12th and November 19th. You can watch any of the series as a recording on our homepage, which we'll show you the link in a sec here. But this series is designed as a master class, which means each session is going to build upon the previous one. So we really would like it if you guys watch these in order. We've structured the webinars to be heavily interactive because while we want and intend to share the content with you, we also want you to be active contributors to the process because we know that many of you have a wealth of experience, knowledge, stories, experiences that will enrich everyone else's experience in learning about the toolkit and the content within. Like I said, we encourage all attendees to attend each session in order. So if you haven't seen the first webinar, I'd say hang on and watch the first one and then come back and watch this one as a recording after that. Each session will be recorded. You can access the recordings either through your GoToWebinar registration link. You click on that, sign in, and it should take you to the video, or you can watch it via YouTube channel link, which will be on the Transportation Toolkit homepage, which is www.mainstreet.org/navigating-main-streets with an S. FYI, there's a chat box in that control panel for you to type in any questions you have. We're not going to answer them during the session. We'll answer them at the end of the hour. So at the end of the hour, we'll read your questions aloud, as many as we can in that time allotment. Anyone we don't get to, we can come back to over email, behind the scenes. We have about 500 people registered for this webinar, so please make sure your speakers have been muted. We have you on mute, but sometimes a little sound sneaks in, so please mute yourselves as well. If you are... So that's me. Sorry, I skipped that one. That's me, Lindsay Wallace. Okay. If you are seeking AIA or AICP credits, we are offering that for this webinar series. For AIA, you want to fill out your name and your member number within that survey, which link you see there. It'll also be in the assignment PDF that we'll talk about at the end of the session, which is also in your handouts tab on the right-hand side there. If you click on that little box that says handouts 205, it'll be your second handout. That Google form will be linked in that as well. For AICP credits, those are available via self-report. So we'll get to that in 1 sec. We are really excited to welcome you and kick off the second in this series that is going to expand on the first one to talk more about our transportation toolkit. And today we're going to talk about some content from Chapter 1. Before we get to all of that, I wanted to briefly talk about what the questions we asked last time and the assignment that you guys had this past week. Thank you for everybody for participating. In the kickoff of the first webinar, we asked what your role is in your community, and it really ran the gamut. It really spoke to what we were trying to get at with this toolkit, which is this toolkit is for everybody involved in your transportation systems and streetscapes. And we are really pleased to see a variety of participants and people interested because these projects and initiatives can't get done well without all of your participation and communication with each other. So thank you for that. From your assignment, we asked about assets and opportunities you see in your communities, and it was really pretty cool that many of you answered the same things for both. So some of you have good multimodal transit, walkable design. quality built resources, trails and trail access, which is huge, some streetscape beautification projects. I really liked that people had answered your assets being complete streets policies and people and organizations that you can go to. Those are resources and assets you should be thinking about. And opportunities, we're seeing a lot of the stuff that people had talked about being assets in their communities. Those of you who don't have those saw those as opportunities, and I think that's right on. So you see a little sampling there in this slide. Great. Okay. So just a quick reminder about who we are if you're not familiar with our organization. So Project for Public Spaces is an international leader in placemaking practice, community development. They've been an organization since 1975 and are based in New York City. So they have been all around the world. They're based in NYC, but have been to 52 countries since 1975 and have worked in over 3,500 communities. A big reach. And then we at Main Street America, we are an organization that really focuses on place-based, sustainable, and inclusive economic development. We work in commercial districts across the country in about 1,000 communities across the country, and we work with about 45 state, city, and county level partners that operate at that level. So we are known for our Main Street approach, which one of our speakers will talk a little bit about in a bit. We're headquartered in Chicago, but we really have a pretty national reach and a pretty spread out staff to accommodate that. Quick thing about our partnership. So we at Main Street America have been lucky to be working with the Project for Public Spaces in a formal way since about 2015, 2016. We have done 10 statewide workshops together on placemaking and economic development. We've convened a few other national workshops and convenings. And currently, in addition to this exciting work around transportation, we've also been working with PPS and Brookings on the Auntie and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking, which you see a little clip down there. If you visit that website, you can see some of the work we've been doing together there. And this partnership is a pretty natural fit because the way we approach community and economic development is very similar to the way Project for Public Spaces advocates for placemaking, the placemaking process, in prioritizing community engagement and collaboration, emphasizing the importance of asset mapping and understanding what needs and wants are in a community before assuming solutions, adapting to unique traits, elevating unique assets and needs of specific places, and of course value learning from incremental implementation and evaluation, iteration, all of those kinds of things. We're very similar in that way. So a quick overview of today's webinar agenda. So we're going to do a quick repeat, talk about the toolkit story to give you some framing about the main content, which is on transportation matters. So that if you follow along in the toolkit, Chapter 1 explores 6 different themes, and we'll have 3 expert speakers to talk about those 6 themes. We have Nadine Gulati from PPS, Matt Wagner from Main Street America, and Laura Torchio from PPS as well. After they dive deeply into those themes, we'll talk about how all of these pieces talk together. We'll queue up the assignment for next week, and then we'll hit up the Q&A at the end. So just some images there of our speakers today. As I said, Nadine, Matt, and Laura will be your main people today. So we're really excited that they had time to devote to this. They have bring a lot of expertise to bear on the topics at hand. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Shaylee.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Lindsay. So I'm an associate at Project for Public Spaces, and I've been at PPS for about a year. I'm very excited for you to hear from our impact translators, some of the toolkit reviewers who are joining us today, to share about how transportation in our streets impact both individual and community livelihoods. But before we get to that, I'd like to provide a refresher on the context for this webinar and where it is situated in the entire Transportation Toolkit story. So last week in the first webinar of this series, we provided that overarching introduction for the multi-part toolkit, how it came about, how it is organized, who it's for, and how it can be accessed and then utilized to support our work and our conversations. In that webinar, we explained why we thought the toolkit could be useful and allow Main Street leaders of all sorts to re-see their streets for the fundamental backbones and great public place resources that they are. In that first webinar, we also recognized that navigating transportation and streets work is really complex and does require many, many stakeholders. So that is why the toolkit chapters and the next 3 webinars provide further commentary on how you might navigate those conversations, those strategies, and those project build-outs together with your communities. These next 3 webinars will follow along with the chapters, answering the questions of why does transportation matter for Main Street? What is a part of the nuts and bolts of creating streets that put people first? And how can we put it all together and actually build a better street together? Today we're going to focus on this first chapter of why the toolkit and expand on the answers for that first question of why does transportation matter for Main Street. We'll hear about topics that prove the need for refocusing on the streets of Main Street, and we'll hear about evidence, resources, and tools that can help us navigate and communicate those whys. This chapter and webinar session also builds off the themes from last week by expanding the conversation of streets as places. In the handbook, you will find that the start of the chapter on why transportation matters begins with this topic of streets as places. It's a philosophy and strategy for seeing that entirety of a street and not just its pavement and not just its mobility function. Streets as places is about seeing the full potential of how streets can put people first. As you will continue to see today, the streets as places and streets for people first concepts are the anchors, ideas for why we do things, what we hope to see, and how we plan to get things done together. So a little more about how we organize the content within Chapter 1 of the toolkit. In developing Chapter 1, we wanted to collect evidence that might support leaders in understanding why they should reevaluate their streets and transportation systems. And we also wanted to collect this information so that the same leaders could then share out the reasons with fellow community leaders. In essence, we collected all this information we possibly could make it easier for everyone to both navigate those reasons and then start the conversations in their own communities. To kind of take all of the different resources and things that we've been learning, we wanted to organize it around 6 impact areas. And these are equity, safety, health, environmental sustainability, economic vitality, and community. In the toolkit, we present each of these 6 areas first through a discussion of the costs associated with solely car-oriented streets, and through a discussion of the benefits that can be gained from a people-oriented approach for streets. You might notice how all of these are anchored to the concept of streets as places, including in this graphic. And since all of these impact areas do, in fact, recognize the value of the street and its transportation as to both the people and the place. We'd love for you to take a look at the handbook and online resource library to discover more about these 6 areas. And then today we are happy to have our guest speakers who will present more personalized commentary on these themes. Before we do that, I want to have us do an interactive exercise, kind of like we did last time. And then this time we're going to ask you kind of what matters to you the most in your current work and around these 6 areas. So I'm going to transition to our Mentimeter. So here is the question. In this situation with Mentimeter, instead of the word cloud that we saw last time, we're going to have dots collect, and they're going to answer the question of which areas matter the most to your current work concerning streets and transportation. So pull up menti.com on your phone or a different browser and type in that code of 501009. Once you have that opened, you can type in the code and select up to 3 of the 6 impact areas which matter the most to your current work. We know that many of you probably recognize the value of all 6 of these areas, but we're curious to see where many of you primarily work and what many of you are already focused on, so that we can see where more resources are already and where more conversations can become. Love seeing all the fun dots collect. Please continue to add the dots. And if you happen to not be able to, also feel free to add to the chat box or the question box and go to webinar, and we'll also add that to the screen after the fact. It's fun to see them all bounce around, and we're glad to see how you all are starting to connect to these. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation, but please note that this will still be available as we continue in the webinar and for some time after. So continue to add if you haven't already, and using that code of 5010 and 09. So now we're going to come back. Now we'd like to share the mic, so to speak, with our three great impact translators. Nadine, Matt, and Laura all have rich backgrounds in advocating with communities around streets as great public resources. With this experience in hand, they are all able to translate for us how streets and transportation systems really do impact each of these 6 areas. They're going to share 2 of the 6 impact areas each, so by the end we'll have touched on all of the topics in some way or another. Through evidence they will share, costs and benefits they will outline, and conversation pieces they bring up. We hope that you will be thinking about how your own work connects with each of these areas, regardless of how you may have just answered that interactive question. We also hope that you will be open to hearing how each area overlaps with one another and how different pieces of evidence might bridge the gaps in conversations you might be having in your own communities. So first, we're going to have Nadine speak to both safety and equity for main streets and their transportation.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Shaylee, for having me on this webinar. My name is Nadine Gulati. I'm the Program Manager for Streets and Transportation here at Project for Public Spaces. And a little bit of where I'm coming from. I come to this work entirely from personal experience. And my training is in architecture and urban research. What got me started in the field of transportation and streets as places particularly was a life move that I made from the small little town of New Delhi, India, to a small little town called College Station, Texas. And I did that move as a non-driver, fully independent grown adult woman who suddenly felt in a very surrounded by a built environment for the cars, losing my independence and seeing a deep impact on my social, psychological, and even physical health. And that led to me asking a key question of access. Who does or doesn't have access to transportation and transportation infrastructure, which we know is our largest shared public space. So in most of America and some other part of the quote-unquote developed West, you need a car to play in that playground, and even though we all pay for it in monetary and environmental costs. So trying to understand that status quo and challenging that status quo was what led me to this work at Project for Public Spaces, because I always saw that the stakes are far too high. I come from 2/3 of the world where, 2/3 of the world's population lives in the global South, and cities that I'm intimately familiar with are replicating the mistakes that have been made in the United States at an astronomical pace. And we all know and understand that the way we get around needs to change, and the way we need to think about our cities has to change all at the same time to get to a more sustainable future. So with that, let's talk about the future of these cities and the future that we all, sitting anywhere around the world, can kind of see eye to eye with. And we will need to think systematically about transforming transportation, transforming main streets, and transforming our cities. And through this transformation, we need to prioritize options and opportunities on our streets. And we need to think about them as what they are, communal resources that put human interaction above isolated movement. I love this graphic. I'm going to go back to it for a second because it shows, again, the intricate ways in which our cities work together and all the ways in which we need to be thinking about transportation and transformation to achieve a different kind of Main Street. Not just the asphalt, not just transportation, but also the way in which we design and conceive our cities at any level. So at the macro level, we need to be thinking about building in density, and we need to be thinking about how we get people to live a little bit closer to each other so that we can build in those options and opportunities to get around our cities in a different way. But for the Main Street, there are two levels that tie in more closely to that. The intermediate level, which is the neighborhood level. We need to be thinking about the basic conditions of our streets, and we need to be thinking about aesthetics, but we also need to be thinking about basic infrastructure that allows people to get from point A to point B in a meaningful way. And at the micro level, we need to be thinking about how do we, sorry, we're still in neighborhoods, my apologies. We need to be thinking about designing for slower speeds, and we need to be thinking about creating a fabric that is diverse enough, that engages the human body in a different way, facades that are diverse enough, that create a richness of a fabric. And at the micro level, which is also something we are very familiar with at the Main Street level, is how do we create experiences for people, moments where people make memories, because at the heart of it, that's how Project for Public Spaces, and that's how I see placemaking, is it's a space filled with lots and lots of meanings that people attach to that space. So at the micro level, which is the real, true human scale, how do we create the little moments of interaction that people can all relate to and that people actually use to construct their memories? So whether that is through creating experiences on the actual sidewalks or thinking about play streets and closing streets down for automobile traffic, thinking about different types of pavement patterns and things like that, it's important to think about those experiences and how people interact and play on their streets. And do those interactions then lend themselves to social interaction, because social memories are a very important part of how we attach meaning to a particular space. So do people get to engage with each other, even in, through micro engagements and exchanges of glances and exchanges of smiles and things all like that. And the lens that I bring to this work is different in a way that I do have a priority audience that I try to cater through all the work that we do, and that requires asking a critical question of who are we designing the street for and why. So each one of us has a different history, different life story that we bring to this work. The way I look at it is children and young families, and how do we create streets that are great for them, because children are the fastest learners. They're at that stage of the human species. Their habits are still formed. The status quo hasn't quite settled in their brain yet. So if we're thinking about creating a whole generation-wide change, we have to think about kids. And they have the most to gain or lose from the environment that we're creating right now, especially if we consider the turnaround time for any one of our projects. So when the projects come live and all the capital investments are done, we're impacting the life of a different generation than our own. So that's just the lens that I bring in, and you will see that kind of roll out through the rest of the presentation. Because it's a huge part of equity. We're critically looking at equity here in terms of the different races, ages, cultural backgrounds that we bring into the work that we do and the cities that we live in and our lived experiences. So that's the first section that we're going to right now. So streets that prioritize the automobile have tremendous costs for some of the most vulnerable populations that we know of. One of those populations that we can think about is the carless, and people who are unable to drive for any variety of reasons. Kids would definitely fall into this category because they're not driving and they are carless. So how are our streets serving this population? And a lot of times they're not. So that is a tremendous cost for us to be thinking about in terms of equity and the way we design our streets. And another layer of the age equity here is the people who have gotten to a place in their lives where they're not driving for any particular reason, whether that is ability or just the fact that they're past a certain age point in their life, they're not driving. And if that severely restricts their mobility and ability to live their full life, that is a cost that we need to consider. The next one is also very close to my heart, the gender bias that is built into a lot of our design of our streets. So if anyone of you is familiar with Caroline Credo Perez's work and Invisible Women, you will know that the way our streets are designed and the way they cater to, there's a huge gender bias based into that. So that's a cost that we need to be considering as well. And there is a lot of income-based exclusion in the way streets are designed. Who are our streets for? We know that people with lower incomes, lower access to mobility devices and mobility are more vulnerable to lots of different types of crashes and things like that. Race is a big factor in there too, because the more we synthesize that data of who gets injured on our streets, we find that a majority of our population, that is people of color, are more vulnerable to injuries on our streets as well. We talked about this a little bit, but there are lots of layers to ability, thinking about people who have motor abilities and other sensory abilities different from the 50th percentile male in this world. They have different abilities, and that's a cost we need to consider. Nation of origin and language, lots of things are in certain language, lots of things are designed in a way, are social cues that don't always account for the cultural and other differences in people and users of our actual streets. Family types and street user types is another cost that we need to be thinking about, but there are benefits. With the more we think about it from a benefits approach, if you look at the Main Street Toolkit more closely, we are talking about an approach that actually supports autonomy of the little kids. If their mobility needs are considered, it allows them to go from dependent to independent human beings. It allows them to become more socially mobile, because if you're not physically mobile on your streets, you can't be socially mobile, you're not having those interactions, you're not looking at people in the eye, and you're not seeing somebody who potentially is from a totally different walk of life than your own. Your sense of belonging can be hugely benefited from a Main Street Toolkit-based approach. You feel physically, psychologically, socially healthier, and thereby you feel a sense of ownership and stewardship towards your street because you're interacting with it more intimately. As our founder of Project for Public Spaces says, we plan and plan, and then we get what we plan for. So if we want people on our streets, we'll get people, but if we design our streets for cars, that's what we're going to get. I'm going to breeze through these because I'm running low on time. The second category I'm going to talk about is safety. The thing to keep in mind is at any stage in our lives, we make all our decisions around safety, and especially for kids, the decisions that parents and caregivers are making for their children are all intended to allow for better safety outcomes. But that's not always what the outcomes are. So the costs here are streets that are designed around automobiles and single-person mobility have tremendous costs in terms of who's vulnerable in terms of crashes. And the speed has a detrimental effect. When a crash does happen, the faster you're going, the smaller your cone of vision, the higher the chances of you injuring somebody fatally. We lose out on streetscape investments in other ways. The more we're investing in the asphalt, the more maintenance, the more we ignore the other things. And again, if we're orienting our infrastructure towards the automobile and where the automobile moves, we are inherently building in costs that lend themselves to perceived and actual crime. But the benefits on the flip side are, we were just talking about safety and crashes. If we design streets around human activity, the outcomes are directly in terms of saved lives and improved accessibility. There's a reduction in crime because we are now focusing the activity and the infrastructure and investment onto the human activity on the streets. And we're facilitating more eyes on the street. If somebody can see me, I inherently feel more safe. The more people who can see me walking around as a woman on the streets, the safer I feel. But there are lots of other benefits that have been documented for having more and more eyes on the streets. And these can be built in more sort of lighter, quicker, cheaper is what we say, but we can tactical ways start to include more eyes on the streets. Not all of these investments need to be capital intensive. And if we needed to focus a space where these investments have to be made, we can think about the last half-mile zone. So if people are taking the bus, their connectivity from their home to their bus and that last half mile, if we concentrate our investment on that zone, that has tremendous benefits in terms of people feeling invited and people feeling safe on their streets. Micromobility is helping with that half-mile connectivity too. And overall, we feel that the human activity and the human scale is being prioritized. That starts to pay dividends. With that, I'm going to hand it over.
Great. Thank you so much, Nidhi. You did a really tremendous job. That's really interesting and complicated stuff that I'm so glad we're here to talk about and for you to share your expertise. So thank you for that. I'm just handing it over to Dr. Matt Wagner, who is the Vice President of Revitalization Programs here at Main Street America. Among many other things, he leads our technical services program and offerings, as well as our research. It is a burgeoning sector of our work. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt. Matt, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Lindsay. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about our economic vitality work and community and how it relates to place, and specifically in transportation. But it was just apropos that actually this morning I had the opportunity to talk with a reporter with the Chicago Tribune. And the subject was around holiday markets and Christmas markets. Now, how does that relate to the topic of today? Of course, you're probably asking yourself. Well, the interesting thing is, while there was a lot of conversation around like authenticity of the actual products that are there, and certainly the storytelling that goes with these markets, what it boiled down to was the need for place and the importance of place and how these things are configured, their location. You don't commonly see them placed out at the local fairgrounds or at the suburban shopping center. That being near other retailers, restaurants, other things to do and activities is part of their attraction. And so this relationship between either an event or an activity in place promotes economic vitality and then provides a place for community engagement that's so important. So I'm going to, as I mentioned, talk a little bit more about economic vitality and community. I'm going to start with economic vitality. But I think we're seeing overall, through a lot of different trends, the importance of place and the role of economic vitality. One only has to look at like, where are we seeing the highest vacancy rates in real estate markets right now? Well, they're tending to be in suburban office parks, where people aren't feeling connected to anything, where they're having to drive to those locations, park, and then they're held like prisoners essentially all day in their offices without the ability to go anywhere else. Or even the fact that we haven't built a new mall in this country in more than 3 decades. And so things are really changing around how consumers are looking to shop, where people are looking to work, and even along the housing front, and where we're putting more housing. So all this is sort of intertwined between place, economic vitality, and certainly components of transportation. So in our role, or in our world, when we think about Main Street and our approach, you'll see in the upper left-hand corner is this sort of starred effect around economic vitality. And that, again, will be the thrust of the conversation. But we also want you to know and really see that this doesn't exist in isolation, that these things are connected to each other, that design and how we think about the street, how we think about buildings, park system, trail systems, or whatever, are integrally part of the role of economic vitality, and in fact impact them tremendously, as do things like having a good organizational structure, the effective leaders, and then certainly the ability to tell a story and promote and enhance the work that you're doing. Oops, didn't that go? All right, there we go. So a couple stories and examples around this, because again, I think for the first time, we've been around for almost 40 years, and there's just so many different sort of trend intersections around place that are finally coming back to sort of core values that we promote and folks like Project for Public Spaces promotes. You see this in this slide that talks about our recent Smart Growth America and Cushman & Wakefield survey that was done. And for the first time, these other sort of non-traditional factors of how we think about corporate relocations, where we place manufacturing operations, things like, utility rates and land cost and wages and those sorts of things that really mattered a lot in the past, while they still may have significance in certain industry types. What you see here is that more and more people are starting to respond to characteristics of place, that the ability to attract talent is directly enhanced by the place at which you're going to locate your new entrepreneurial venture or a Fortune 500 company. Even the streets, the fabric of the buildings, the character of the space are all mattering much, much more, and certainly connectivity to other activities besides just the place that you're going to work. So we're also seeing that there's a number of factors relative to how businesses get started. And this is certainly part of our work within economic vitality and is becoming ever more important, I think, in how we think about filling vacancies and cultivating strong economies within our communities. And again, traditionally, what we found, whether it was in economic development groups or in academic circles around this concept of how do we support entrepreneurs, you saw the common things around policy and well-trained entrepreneurs or workforce to support those new companies, or having a good culture or mentors, and certainly the whole financial aspects. But we think it's important to actually introduce a new part of this framework, and that's really around the physical environment and the sense of place that are really, truly mattering in these things. So one only has to look at the recent Amazon HQ2. So many of you are probably familiar with the storylines, lots of press coverage around that. And again, these traditional forces at play in whether it was a Fortune 500 company or a brand new startup, sense of place was incredibly important. In their RFP, they talked about things like, transportation and access to diversity of transportation, to being able to attract talent. These are all components of place, again, whether that's in the recruitment of a large operation or the startup in support of new entrepreneurial ventures. Some of the ways that we see this taking or having impact can be both indirectly, but certainly direct, in how we think about economic vitality in the intersection with place. So just indirectly, there's certainly items like just having good public amenities. We're seeing housing is playing a much larger role in all sectors of entrepreneurship and economic development overall, to artwork, and but also having, frankly, just a diversity of uses. That in these sort of sterile or just one-off kinds of function places, whether that's in a big box or still a regional mall that still exists, et cetera, that having diversity of uses is also very attractive, whether it's services, small-scale manufacturing, retail, civic, et cetera. And then directly, we're seeing how real estate functions as a matter of place are also enhancing the entrepreneurial space. So we're seeing the creation of more sort of drop-in spaces for remote workers or neutral location businesses, more pop-ups. And in fact, these places like our downtowns or our urban commercial districts are almost becoming like research and development hubs for new entrepreneurs. We're cutting barriers to entry, and we're adding new spaces at which they can test their products and better market them. And the barriers to entry are much lower than in previous aspects. Yeah. Okay. On that note is just how we're seeing place impacted in different sectors. So one is small-scale manufacturing. I'll just mention briefly that we're seeing huge changes. And in fact, it was transportation that was a core component of how we lost manufacturing in our dense places like downtowns and urban districts, but now is actually enhancing that factor. Changes in like UPS and FedEx make it much easier for smaller scale manufacturers to be able to distribute from a downtown building. The character of place is part of their whole operation. And again, I ask you, where do you see most breweries, microbreweries locate? They're in downtown buildings or in old warehouse buildings. They're not necessarily worried about being able to distribute from an industrial park setting. So just switching to sort of some barriers, some costs that we see in our role of economic vitality and how they're related. Certainly, there's always this debate around, if we build something new out on the outskirts, it seems like no one thinks about the cost of that. But if you offer the alternatives, that's where the cost discussion comes up. But I think those things are starting to change. I was in Bristol, Virginia, in a small town in rural Appalachia, and they were talking about, do we really need a parking garage? Is that realistic? Is that really something we should be investing in, given the changing dynamics of density and ride share and bike trails, et cetera? There's also a lot of just benefits, frankly, that we, I think, can better position in our arguments around why place matters and why good transportation systems are at core. It impacts the ability for people to visit our communities, to invest in entrepreneurship and small business support, and more importantly, I think with consumer changes, it really creates that experiential shopping engagement. So just in summary, along the economic vitality and why place matters, it's really about creating these distinct sense of place. It's very authentic, and it's the glue that really holds these commercial districts together. We think that place is becoming an ever more critical factor in attracting and retaining great entrepreneurial talent, or frankly, just supporting those larger operations that you have in your community and their ability to create and recruit talent. And they're also helping us to generate new forms of business, and they're relating better to generational shifts and trends in shopping and in business location decisions. All right, so switching to community, I want to just talk a little bit about how place matters in this particular regard, and that if you're not including community in these discussions, it's really not sustainable in the long run. So this is just a graphic that really showcases how both we at Main Street America, along with Project for Public Spaces, really enhances and brings community engagement to the forefront. So for instance, our own work, when we're looking at markets and where we're trying to understand how communities can better perform from an economic vitality position, the inputs of that are not just market data and sort of asset-based analysis, but it's also talking to community, and not just the traditional who we think are the leaders in the community. It really matters and is so important, I think, to this whole space of community engagement, that we're really looking at a diverse sector of folks and how do we engage them within this process. So these are just some examples about how we tell stories as we engage community, how we feature them from a sense of place. And those can be all the things from history to cultural aspects of place, to the physical environment of place. But in everything that we do, we're largely showcasing these kinds of elements as they relate to the community at large, our visitors, et cetera. In terms of some of the cost of car-oriented streets and some of the dynamics that occur when you have this dynamic happening on community, unfortunately, we've seen over really a sense of throughout history where these have largely created barriers, through urban renewal. Great example of how we displaced thousands of folks that didn't have political power and segregated them really through transit-oriented development in many respects. And so we've artificially created barriers to community connection as a result. And frankly, that's been a huge cost to many neighborhoods, and over the years has seen sustained disinvestment as a result. And then finally, just in sort of wrapping up, I think there's just so many benefits to how we think about not only community, but the integration of community and economic vitality in place. When you have this, and this is a great picture from 8th Street, if you're not familiar, this is in DC, great neighborhood there. But it's really about bringing folks together. And when you have this working at all levels, you've got democracy and action. There's a great sense of place. It builds character within your community, and people feel special about it. Again, all one has to ask is, where do you hold your holiday parade? Where do sports teams tend to celebrate when they win a championship? Where do people want to gather when they're celebrating an event, a birthday, a wedding, or what have you? A lot of times it's in places, again, that really showcase the sense of place, that are people-oriented and dynamic from a transportation perspective, and they give us the ability to engage with one another. So thanks for your time. I'm going to turn it back over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Matt. Wonderful. Such interesting stuff. I'm going to turn it over to our partner, Laura Torchio, over at Project for Public Spaces. I have had the great pleasure of working with Laura for a while now, and so excited she was able to share her expertise on this today. I'm going to say really fast, we probably won't have a lot of time for Q&A, so if you guys want to enter your questions in the question box, we can answer those after the webinar. We want to make sure we give Laura enough time to talk about what she's here to talk about. So with that, Laura, go for it. And
awesome. Thank you, and I'll do my best to talk fast but clear. So I'm Laura Torchio. I'm Deputy Director of Transportation at Project for Public Spaces. I've been with the organization for 3.5 years, but I've been at this work for, well, I'm not going to say because it'll share how old I really am. But I've worn many hats in my career. I've been public sector, private sector, advocacy work, even tourism. And one of the things I learned along the way is that what jazzes me the most is when people are zealous about civic engagement. And I find that when people get active, it's because they had an aha moment where suddenly they were looking at the world that had maybe become very monotonous to them through some new lenses. One of the first walkability audits I went on was with my colleague and now friend, Jack Molinar. He's with the Rutgers University Department of Transportation in New Jersey. And he took me on this walk audit, and he was showing me how to look at the street through new lenses. And he said to me, "You were never going to see the street the same way again." And it's true. I don't see the street the same way. I'm always looking for ways to improve walkability, bikeability, human connections, and things like that. And I hope that coming out of this webinar series, you'll all be looking at your streets in a new way. Nadine and Matt told really great stories that show how streets and transportation can both negatively and positively impact our communities, and how each impact can have a ripple effect in terms of scale, reach, and intensity. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or less talking about transportation costs and benefits of the final two themes in Chapter 1, our health and our environment. Former U.S. Surgeon General Murthy said, "Everyone should have access to spaces and places that make it safe and easy to walk. Walkable communities are good for social connectedness, good for business, good for the environment, and most importantly, good for our personal health. And what makes a walkable community? Our streets." What if we are intentional about improving the health, whether it's social health, physical health, financial health, of individuals, of communities, and environments, and in the process not exploiting other people, nature, or the future? When we think of streets as places, we can begin to go beyond the movement of people and goods and focus on the impacts our streets have on the rest of our lives. A 2013 Robert Wood Johnson Foundation study found that a person's zip code can be a more reliable determinant of health than their genetic code. If you haven't heard of determinants of health, they include things like the social and economic environment, the physical environment, as well as a person's individual characteristics and behaviors. This map on the right shows gaps in health across New York City neighborhoods. In New York City, if you reside near the Met City Field, your average life expectancy is 84. But if you live near Yankee Stadium, your life expectancy might be 7 years shorter. And it has nothing to do with the fortunes of the teams. It has everything to do with zip codes. The point of the social determinants of health is that the choices we make, or our personal behaviors, depend on the choices available to us. Some neighborhoods have more liquor stores than grocery stores. Some neighborhoods lack safe and affordable housing or have unsafe car-focused streets. And many urban and rural areas have experienced generations of isolation from opportunities. Good health is one of the greatest outcomes of a thriving community, and it quickly becomes clear that place matters for health. With that in mind, how have we been designing our places? Have we been designing roads that you can't cross or walk along and that even make driving stressful? I'm trying to advance my slide. Have we been creating neighborhoods without connections, or ones that just to get 5 minutes away by walking, we would have to drive 15 minutes by car? Have we been providing plenty of unhealthy food choices and very few healthy food choices? And social isolation, especially for vulnerable members of our communities like seniors. And when we're designing routine physical activity out of our lives, even in places you'd least expect that to be the case. So streets designed primarily for the movement of vehicles have many unintended consequences for public health, as they create barriers to opportunities and resources which have cascading negative impacts on the physical, mental, and social health of individuals and communities. But the good news is the health benefits of people-oriented streets are far-reaching. When streets are walkable, people are naturally more physically active. When streets are flexible and accessible, people have more access to healthy foods and other health services. And people-first streets support community culture and mental health. The bottom line is when streets are for people, positive health outcomes increase. And the same goes for environmental sustainability. Jane Jacobs, an early influencer of the Streets as Places movement, said, "The fragile ecology of a city neighborhood and the fragile ecology of the Arctic stand or fall together. Main streets matter for the long-term protection of our natural resources, as well as social, economic well-being." According to the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University, community resilience is generally defined as the ability to adapt to, withstand, or rapidly recover from a disaster or catastrophic event. Research and experience suggest that communities with greater capacity, as defined by their access to human, social, political, and economic capital, and greater capabilities in developing these resources, are more likely to be resilient in the face of disaster. When we think about resilience, we tend to think about the physical infrastructure that can help withstand and protect us from natural disasters. But what we're learning is that car-oriented streets reduce personal interaction and result in low social capital. When the built environment supports interaction, we get high social capital and a strong social infrastructure. In Eric Kleinenberg's 2002 book, Heat Wave, about the 1995 heat wave in Chicago, he defines social infrastructure as the network of people, places, and institutions that foster cohesion and support. This is the short version of that story. In 1995, Chicago experienced a heat wave with temperatures up to 126 degrees Fahrenheit. By the time the heat wave broke a week later, streets had buckled, power grids had failed, people were without electricity, and the death toll rose and rose. Over 700 people had perished, more than twice the number that died in the Chicago fire in 1871. The 1995 heat wave was one of the deadliest in American history. In his study, Kleinenberg was curious as to why two very similar neighborhoods, North and South Lawndale, fared so differently. He conducted what he referred to as a social autopsy, examining the social, political, and institutional organs of the city that made this urban disaster so much worse than it ought to have been. What he found was that North Lawndale had a better social infrastructure. People knew each other. They checked on each other. They helped each other out. A great example comes from urban designer and theorist Donald Appleyard, who taught us that the social life of a street has a lot to do with the level of car traffic on the street. His research is reflected in this image. A heavy traffic street, like the one on the left, supports few social interactions, and a light traffic street, like the one on the right, supports many. As Nadine mentioned before, we know that if you design for cars and traffic, you'll get cars and traffic. And although the adverse environmental effects of car-oriented streets have long been documented, traditional transportation approaches still favor the movement and storage of cars above all else. The cost of doing so becomes more evident every year, particularly as they contribute to global climate change. On the flip side, if we design for people and places, we'll get people and places. Street design is among the most important environmental decisions a community makes, affecting everything from clean air and water to efficient land use and the quality of animal, plant, and human life. In terms of environmental sustainability, Phil Myrick, CEO of the Project for Public Spaces, says, "We can try to outsource our problems to a new generation of green engineers, designers, and architects, but we will only see broad, lasting changes when the people inhabiting these communities create a vision for the future and lead the process for change. Transportation matters to Main Street, and the transportation choices we make impact so much more." So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Shaylee.
Thank you, Nat. Nadine, Matt, and Laura, we appreciate your presentations and the value that you've added to our toolkit in this series. To kind of bookend the conversations, I just want to bring us back to that overarching value I introduced last week of talking together. It's all both about talking together, people to people, but also about how the pieces of the toolkit and the chapters speak together. So all of our chapters kind of build off of each other and also support how we might have the different conversations. All of the pieces, the handbook has that evidence, it clearly laid out, while the online resource library is going to bring more links and more resources to your disposal. And this webinar series is really to showcase some stories, to hear some different voices, and kind of create the repetitions of why streets matter. And also, as you've seen today, there's so many different connections between all of these 6 impact areas. They all talk together, and they all show that are interconnected to each other and show the value that streets as places can provide. If you think about it, a street that's safer for a child and their guardian can mean things like equity. It can mean that businesses get more foot traffic and support the community that surrounds that economic vitality. So all of these 6 impact areas really do talk to each other and show that even if you are working in one area, you might actually be influencing someone else's work. So at the top of the webinar, how we had that interactive exercise to show the things that you primarily care about in your work. Really, all of the street and transportation provides really does connect all of the different things that we're doing. So we also then, since we recognize that, we encourage you to talk together with your communities, recognizing the value of the areas that they are in and how the streets can bring you guys together. We do have another interactive exercise. I think that for the sake of time, we'll skip it. I just wanted to show you real quick the screen. So it's going to be, again, on Mentimeter. And that question is really just what stood out to you today. So please feel free to add this after the webinar. It's going to be menti.com, and then you'll enter this new code that's 148876. And this is where we just want you to say what stood out to you, what connections did you see, what maybe new lessons you learned from the speakers and from the presented impact areas. So just want you to see that, and this link will still be available after the webinar and beyond. So Lindsay, do you want to kind of take it back and wrap up and tell them about the PDF assignment?
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you to everybody for their time and expertise today. Great to have new voices kind of talking about what we've been covering in the toolkit. Yeah, so you know about the multi-part toolkit by now, hopefully. And webinar series, as you know, we have 4 weeks, and we have 2 weeks left as of the end of this one. So November 12th, November 19th, those are Tuesdays, 1 to 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. You can always listen to the recordings as well. You'll be getting an email after this broadcast to show you where you can access that. and that's a free link. Feel free to share the link to the homepage if you have people who might want to check it out themselves. Q&A, I'm sorry to say we don't have time today for this, but we would love for you to send us your questions either via the question box, or once this broadcast is over, you'll see our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us directly, and you'll see our emails in just a sec. The question that we have there will be in your assignment form, so feel free to answer that. The assignment is in a PDF that we'll send out in an email after this broadcast. It's also available in that little handouts box there on your right if you wanted to download it now. So essentially, for next week, we'd love you to think about the 6 impact areas we talked about and name one amenity, feature, or asset of your commercial district, street, and transportation system that positively represents that selected impact area. And then describe the connection you see between that asset and the impact you selected. So just a quick description of that connection. And if you want to, you can share a photo as well. That's all part of that Google form that's linked in that PDF for you to check out. And then to reiterate the question we noted here, in that form we asked, what conversations are already going on in your communities that relate to one of the 6 impact areas. So please do that assignment. If you have any questions about it, you'll see our contact information here. Next week, we're going to be covering Chapter 2 from the toolkit, nuts and bolts of People First Streets. So we'll be getting into policies, programming, infrastructure, that sort of thing, all those juicy in-the-weeds details I'm sure you're excited to hear about. So that'll be next week, and we're so excited to present that to you. This is the information of all of the speakers today. Again, feel free to reach out directly to us with any questions. Thanks again for your participation, and we look forward to talking to you next week. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, have a good one.